This week on The Changelog, we're joined by Steve O'Grady, principal analyst and co-founder at RedMonk. The topic today is the definition of open source, the constant pressure on the true definition of the term, and the seemingly small but vocal minority that aim to protect that definition. In Steve's post, Why Open Source Matters, he says, quote, open source is at a crossroads, end quote. And there are some seeking to break the definition of open source to one that is more permissive to their desires, and they're closer than ever to achieving that goal. Today's conversation goes deep on this subject. A massive thank you to our friends and our partners at Fastly and Fly. This podcast gets downloaded everywhere around the world super fast because Fastly is super fast globally. Check them out at fastly.com. And our friends at Fly help us put our app and our database close to our users all over the world with no ops. Check them out at fly.io. What's up, friends? I'm here with James Cowling, co-founder and CTO at Convex. They're one of our new sponsors, and they're building a full-stack platform for the TypeScript era. So, James, in your main navigation, you link to a page called Convex versus Firebase. How similar is Convex to Firebase? And if someone is quickly trying to grok what Convex is that a good comparison?
I think it's a good starting point for sure. I mean, Firebase has been very impactful. And the people we speak to who use Firebase often love it, and they often lament the time they have to move off of Firebase because it's kind of failed to meet their needs as a growing company. So Firebase falls short in a few ways. One is in terms of like a fully relational document model. One is in terms of having strong type system. One is in terms of having this full end-to-end consistency story where you write functions that run on an API server on the data that you can subscribe to. And so one thing I think we see in the Firebase style development model is that you have web applications talking directly to a database in a cloud Firestore. With Convex, what is different is you have your code talking to actual fully fledged TypeScript functions running on your data that you can subscribe to. But I think the Firebase's comparison is fairly apt. And if someone is a Firebase user, I think you will love Convex. And it's certainly designed to fill that niche in the market. It's people who want to build applications without having to mess with infrastructure.
In what way has infrastructure failed specifically application developers?
I think if one was to compare what it looked like to build an application 10 plus years ago to today, it's gotten more complex, not less complex. There's a bewildering amount of frameworks. I think Google, for all their amazing work they do, has had a bad influence on how people build systems, because oftentimes when someone wants to build a web app these days, they're told to like learn Kubernetes or something ridiculous like that. You know, these infrastructure platforms really resemble the shape of the underlying implementation, not the shape of the problem that the application developer is facing. And so even before we started Convex, we're talking to customers, people were like, well, I just want someone to like manage my Kafka cluster. And I say, well, why do you even have Kafka? And like, well, I don't really know. I think the database falls over if I don't put a queue in front of it, or like I need to like buffer some data somewhere. And what became clear is that the tools just weren't serving the needs of the application developers. And I think application developers and front-end framework engineers understand the problem space because they spend all day doing it. They sometimes don't have the power to fix the problem because they don't build the database themselves. And I think oftentimes infra folks don't have enough empathy for the application developer. That at the end of the day, all that matters is the application.
Okay, if you're looking for a better type of backend, Convex is the full stack TypeScript development platform you've been looking for. Replace your database, server functions, and glue code. Get started at convex.dev. That's convex.dev. Again, convex.dev. So finally we have Steven here to talk. Big fans of RedMonk and big fans of the recent post you put out there. We're big fans of open source, as you know. We're big fans to defend what open source is and is not so that the line is clear. And we think that the line needs to be clear because it's just important. And one thing you said from the Why Open Source Matters post you put out there, you said, from the sea of formerly open source relicensed database, which we're aware of, to Meta's repeated poor behavior with respect to its open source licenses, to an as yet unannounced but pending major releasing effort, to even the longtime open source standard bearer, Red Hat, flirting with the limits of license compliance, the definition of open source is besieged. So let's start there.
Yeah, so obviously a lot to unpack there, right? So a couple things off the top. If you wrote code, it's your right to decide on a license for that. Now, it's worth looking at the relicense, the companies that have relicensed, it's worth separating them into two groups. You have one group where 99.9% of the IP is code that they wrote, in which case, they have the right to, as I said, to license that however they like. It's certainly legal. I think it violates the spirit of folks that have done this on a community basis, right? Where the code comes from a bunch of different places. It's typically permissively licensed. Developers from outside of an organization have contributed on that basis. And then that is unilaterally relicensed by a company. Again, they have the right to do that legally. I think it's a different situation. Certainly communities tend to react differently to that. Examples of that. So Mongo writes most of their software. They relicense it. Elastic, sort of took contributions from a variety of places. And, you saw people in that community pretty outraged, sort of when they relicensed. So those are slightly different scenarios. But, at the end of the day, the license permits a relicense, then so be it. The thing to me, the sticking point, in the piece that you referenced is if you're relicensing the code to a non-open source license, just don't call it open source. It's not complicated. Right. And that's the thing that is immensely frustrating because, to your point, Adam, we need a line in the sand. Like we need hey, this is open source. This is something where the code is available, but there's sort of some restrictions on it. And those are not the same thing. And, so myself, number of other people that, you're all familiar with, Adam Jacob and Matt Wilson and so on, I've said this sort of consistently, hey, just call it what it is. And so far, companies are having a tough time doing that.
Yeah. So a few recent events, I think, help inform this conversation. We have Meta's release of Llama 2, which came out with an open source-ish license that said pretty much it's open for both research and commercial use to do as you please with this contingency, as long as you're not. And then they put their restriction, which I think was it was a certain size of user base. It's basically like our competitors. So that's one. Obviously, we have the relicensing of HashiCorp's open source projects to Business Source. And I think HashiCorp was clear in the way that they did that, as far as I can tell. So fair, but a major event, right? Terraform going non-open source Business Source. We have the release of CodeCov by Sentry. The code base for CodeCov goes open source-ish. It goes business source, which is open source eventually. That's kind of their phrase. They called it open source in the release announcement. They then changed it and I believe apologized for using the word flippantly or without discretion, perhaps. So that happened recently. We have Red Hat doing things. So these are there's been a lot going on in this world. And then Matt Acey wrote a piece saying that all of this argumentation about definitions and what really is or is not open source is missing the point because developers really don't care. And they've shown they don't care for years. And he actually had some stats that he went out and gathered and provided for that. Maybe we start right there. What do you think with that argument? Because I'm a developer. I'm in the open source world.
I care.
Well, I've kind of come to a place to care, mostly through this podcast, more than I used to care before I was so well informed, because I was kind of one of the people that just was like, well, I've benefited a lot from open source. I should open source some stuff. I went and looked at the licenses that they had. It was MIT. I put the MIT license on mine. But really what I cared about was freely available, out there to be seen. Source available was important to me because I loved reading source code. Hackability, like that kind of stuff. I wasn't firmly in the camp of it must be according to the open source definition. So Matt's piece in that way identified me as a developer for many years. I've since kind of become more caring than I used to. But what do you think to that point? Developers don't care. So is it just a few ideologues or passionate religious folk who have open source religion that care, and therefore the war is over, or we're going to lose? What do you think?
Certainly, that's the argument. And with all due respect to Matt, who I think is a great guy, I find that argument nonsense, to be honest.
Okay.
And the example that I used in the piece that I wrote up is, it's like climate change, right? It's like arguing that because your average citizen doesn't care about climate change, that climate change doesn't matter. And I think most people, who understand, sort of the science and the implications of it would sort of argue, no, actually, it matters quite a bit, regardless of sort of what they think, right? And, so the fact of the matter is that developers don't care in large part because they haven't had to, because of the definitions that we've had, right? And, developers have been able to, sort of use this huge variety of open source software, right? From operating systems, web servers, containers, languages, framework, pick them, right? We have this sort of immense library of software that's been available, and importantly has been available under open source terms without arbitrary use restrictions, right? So it didn't matter, how many users your company had. It didn't matter how much money your company was making. And that's the thing is that, the argument from, folks behind these licenses is, oh, it's not a big deal. The source is available, which great. Look, if I had a choice between a source available, sort of asset and one that was totally proprietary, I'd pick the source available for sure. Because you want the right to inspect the code, you want the right to take a look at what's happening. But, the problem is that when you introduce these arbitrary restrictions, which the traditional definition of open source prohibits, all of a sudden things get complicated pretty quickly because it's not clear. But, first of all, if you're using a bunch of these projects, okay, which restrictions apply to which license? In other cases, if you're a developer, you may not have access to that, right? You may not have access, for example, if you work for a startup, what your actual revenue is. You don't know that, right? So how do you ensure that you're complying with the terms of a license? So, at the end of the day, it is sort of, I don't quibble with the argument that developers don't care. I just don't think it's terribly meaningful, right? They don't care because they haven't had to because of this definition. And unfortunately, again, kind of like climate change, sort of that, I don't know, benign neglect, if you will, is not doing anybody any favors,
right,
in my view at this point.
Right.
I agree that there's clarity around open source, the definition, but there has been cause for developers to care with regards to selecting a project based on kind of the copy left versus open source divide, even inside of open source community.
Sure.
Because if it's AGPL, for instance, some companies are just like, well, we can't use that. Or if it's GPL, they say we can't use that. If it's MIT, BSD, blah, blah, blah. And so there, to a certain extent, I feel like even as I was an indie dev, so I was just making decisions based on what was best for my customers, not what my boss at a corporation said. But I still didn't want to back them into a corner unnecessarily. So I had to care a little bit, I guess, get into the weeds. But you think this is a different distinction than that?
I think it's a different distinction, for a couple of reasons. First of all, so we obviously have a spectrum of licenses, right? On the one end, we have sort of quote unquote permissive licenses. You mentioned one of them, MIT, Apache, BSD, there's a bunch of them, right? And those impose few, if any, restrictions. A lot of times it's little more than attribution, in terms of what your responsibilities are in terms of using that source code. At the other end of the spectrum, we've had copy left, right? Most sort of famous and notable example of this is the GPL, right? Which basically says, in sort of plain terms, if you use this and make changes and you distribute those changes, then you have to make whatever changes you've made available under precisely the same terms, right? You have to have a reciprocal relationship with the source code. You have to basically share and share alike, right? And so, obviously it's not. And then you have the MPL, which sort of sits in the middle, right? Which is, okay, if you make changes to certain parts, you have to sort of change those parts, right? So those are, you have one end spectrum, the other end, and then things sit in the middle. That being said, those pertain to your responsibilities regarding the source code, right? The difference with a lot of these arbitrary use restrictions is that they don't really have anything to do with the code. It's all about who's using it, right? What field are you in, right? How much money are you making? How many users do you have? And those responsibilities are very different, right? Because a developer can understand sort of what your responsibilities are with respect to source code. But when we're talking about sort of arbitrary uses, they either don't know, in some cases, don't have any control of that in other cases. And, just as importantly, we have a couple decades of understanding as an industry. All right, how do these models like copyleft, or even sort of a more aggressive copyleft like AGPL? So the AGPL closes what's called the distribution loophole, right? So in other words, I could run GPL software on a network and, for a website. I'm not technically not distribution. AGPL says, look, if you're using it in that fashion, you trigger the license and you have to share your changes, right? So we understand how these work. We have an industry consensus of, okay, this is sort of how these things work, and companies have learned to respect that. And really what we've seen sort of recently is a world in which all these arbitrary sort of restrictions are coming up, right? And like I said, it could be revenue based, it could be user based. We saw a push a couple of years ago for ethical licenses, right? So you can't use this for sort of XYZ fields of endeavor. And it was, those conversations with people are hard, because it's like, I can support, all of these, or at least most of the sort of ethical, sort of impulses behind them. And yet they just don't work in practice. You're using the wrong mechanism. The licensing, in my view, is a wrong mechanism for what you're trying to achieve. So, the net of it for me is that there's a meaningful distinction between the way that open source licenses have typically worked in terms of the copyright and how they handle that, and the arbitrary restrictions that are being introduced by, sort of pick, the sort of Llama license, the BSL, any of these sort of licenses that are, sort of being portrayed, like explicitly in cases like Meta as open source, and yet are not, and don't adhere to that definition.
I guess one piece of evidence to this point is the JS Hint project. Adam, do you recall this episode we did years ago with Mike Panisi?
I do recall this.
Who had to go around. So JS Hint was a widely used JavaScript linter, and it had the MIT license, except for at the end was the phrase, the software shall be used for good, not evil, which is an ethical kind of a thing, but it was just an addendum, and that was out there. And when Mike Panisi took the project over, there was lots of trouble where it couldn't get adoption because that added vagary or just question marks around the license, even though other than that, because like, how do you define good and evil, right? And so he told us the whole story, how much work he went through in order to get that relicensed. He had to go back and find all the contributors from times past and get them all to sign a thing. And it was a huge headache. He finally got it all done. That episode is called "You Can Finally Use JS Hint for Evil," which I thought was a good way of saying it. But that's an evidence of like, if you make it vague and confusing, you really are presenting a lot of challenges for a lot of people.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, and that's the thing. Like one of the things that comes up, frequently in these licenses, and the concept, I think the first time I saw it was in the Commons clause, right, which is now sort of largely deprecated. Was this idea of like, this, sort of these restrictions don't against usage don't kick in unless you compete with me. And then the obvious question is, well, who defines that, right? In what way are we talking about competition? Because that's not always as simple as, hey, we're in exactly the same business. It's like, hey, we do things that are sort of the same. There's a little overlap. Now, does the license kick in or does it not? And, I'm not a lawyer, happen to be married to one, but I have spent enough time with lawyers, decades at this point, in this space to understand that, basically, if you put it this way, if you have a project and you only ever want sort of individuals to use it, right, the good versus evil is a good example of this. Like if you don't care, sort of about usage, license it however you want, right? But I think it's difficult to make the argument at this point that, sort of usage by businesses has done anything but, kick lots of money, lots of jobs into the ecosystem. And if you have a project and you have wider ambitions for it, then one of the things you have to learn, and lawyers will tell you, is that ambiguity just doesn't fly, right? No enterprise is going to sort of use a license that says, use this for good or not evil. And a lot of enterprises won't use it if it's, as I said, hey, you can use this unless you compete with me, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because I can remember when the SSPL came out, from Mongo, it was, basically aimed at, cloud providers. But then you have corner cases like, all right, large Fortune 500 organizations, will frequently have, kind of internal hosts, for lack of a better term, and they charge back, to businesses. So they'll run the infrastructure for somebody else. Does that apply there? Technically, if you read sort of the license, probably does. So that's the thing. A lot of these licenses are ambiguous. The terms are, arbitrary in that they vary, from project, to project and company to company. And, that sort of the end state of that is sort of my concern, right? Which is any one of these things, but in and of itself is, all right, it's not ideal, but it's just a single project, it's just a single company. But in other words, what we have at present, as we talked about, is this huge wealth of resources that are licensed in a way that makes them available to developers, sort of worldwide, without these arbitrary, sort of restrictions. If you take the current direction of travel and project that forward, one of the potential outcomes is that we have sort of a mess of new important projects, particularly in the AI space, that now each carry some weird, different license restriction that I now have to keep track of in ways that I never did before, right? And that is a world where, we talked about Llama at the top, when I talk to people about this, they're like, oh, it's not a big deal, it's mostly open. And I'm like, cool, but imagine a world in which Linux or Kubernetes or any of these things was usable by Facebook, but not, sort of Amazon or Google or Microsoft, right? And maybe that's sort of a world that people want, but, I tend to believe that we are better off as an industry, when we have open source projects that are supported by the bulk of the industry. Not in every case, of course, but like I said, if we fast forward to a place where all these licenses become more and more common and they conflict in varying ways, to me, that's a nightmare from a developer standpoint.
There's an obvious advantage to calling yourself open source. And I think that's the challenge here, is like the definition is becoming blurred, besieged even, as you'd said, in regards to the advantage you get from being, in quotes, open source. And so some will want to blur the line for their own advantage, whether intentionally or unintentionally. Like there's an advantage to being open source. And that's why there's a desire to be open source, even though you're not, right?
Yeah, clearly.
We have this conversation all the time, and I'm trying to remember who it was. I really wish I could remember. Anyway, but there was an exchange on Twitter, and we have the conversation literally all the time, which is, hey, I'm open sourcing this thing. It's like, cool, which license? And they're like, well, it's this one that we came up with, or it's this, it's an open source license, but we have these additional riders on it, right? And they're like, okay, cool, that's not open source. And they're like, okay, but the source is available, so it's open source. We're like, no, there's a definition that's been clearly established that means certain things to everybody involved. And they're like, but what do I call it? We're like, hey, there's a bunch of different terms. You can call it source available, you can call it open-ish, you can call it, sort of non-compete, like pick a term, as long as it's not open source. And they come back and say something like, that doesn't mean open source. And developers like open source. And I'm like, exactly? Like, that's
exactly. That
term has value for a reason, and the reason it has value is because people have protected it for a long time, right? This is not the first time, this is not even the 1,000th time that we've argued about the definition of open source and sort of what it means and so on. And, unfortunately, as an industry, it's a battle that we keep having to fight over and over.
Well, it reminds me of what Josh Padnick said, one of the guys behind OpenTF, when he was on the show a couple weeks back, about Terraform and his involvement and the sentiment from the large group of people who decided to fork it. I asked him, because the bait and switch aspect of what HashiCorp did was a driving factor in their feelings. And I said, well, what if it would have been business source from the start? Because then you wouldn't have the bait and switch, but you would not have had an open source project. You would have had a business source project from the very beginning. And his statement was, we would have never invested like we did around a business source project. The fact that it was open source is why they got thousands of developers and probably tens of thousands of hours of labor put into the project because of the goodwill that exists with an open source project, where business source is very close. I mean, it's even open source eventually, as they say, right? But it's not the same thing. And so people see the difference. And so they really want it to be the same thing because, yeah, you have your cake and you eat it too.
Yeah, I tend to be very outspoken on this, but the open source aspect of the business source license to me is that's just a fop, right? That people throw to themselves to make themselves feel better. Because when was the last time you talked to a developer and said, hey, here's a project. Do you want to go use a version that's 2 or 3 or 4 years old, right? No one wants to do that ever, in which case, I mean, I guess it's better than nothing, but it's not, to me, that's not a meaningful contribution, right? Because no one wants super open source code, and that's just not the way it works. And, really what we've seen, from a direction of travel standpoint is that, the quote bait and switch model has just become sort of normalized, right? To a degree, right? In the sense that you use open source to get to a certain point where you are, for lack of a better term, too big to fail. And then, you sort of rug pull and switch the license to something else. And the sort of community typically, just sort of continues on because they don't have an alternative. Or in some cases, like in extreme cases, sort of like OpenTF, they sort of band together and fork. But, the difficulty with that is that the odds are against, those forks. They don't tend to work most of the time. So, jury's out in terms of how that works.
Yeah, we'll see what happens.
Yeah, but, that's the thing is that this is a pattern, right? Which has become sort of more and more common at this point. And, so yeah, a lot of these companies got where they were. Most of the companies, in fact, got where they were because of the permissions and the freedoms afforded by the licenses. And then as soon as it is, to their advantage to change those terms, right? So that they achieve exclusivity or so that they prevent the, sort of competition from, certain, specific competitors, typically cloud providers, but it could be, Hashi was not pointed to cloud providers. They pointed to, sort of other resellers and so on. They changed the terms of license and they expect the communities to just kind of be okay with that. And a lot of them aren't.
Well, speaking of Hashi and cloud providers, as Google just announced a big managed offering, managed Terraform offering. I'm not sure.
They did, yeah.
Yeah, just today or yesterday. So they didn't mention them in their stance, but they're definitely probably feeling it from all sides.
I was just going to echo what you said was the goodwill aspect. I think there's you see that in a lot of aspects, this term goodwill, right? Like if you're in a relationship, marital, friendship, whatever it might be, the goodwill between that relationship is that you're not intending harm. And whenever, and then obviously these companies are building on top of the goodwill of the community. And the goodwill essentially is not just, it's kind of spear-led in some cases, but it's as if there's no harm intended. And whenever you change that definition or you want to relicense to something else, that transitions from a goodwill scenario to a not goodwill scenario. It's like, well, as long as it doesn't hurt me, I'm okay with whatever happens here. But it can hurt you because it restricts. In the case of, I'm thinking back to Josh Padnick and OpenTF, like I would not have invested in this thing if it were licensed as X because there was no goodwill towards me, but because it had goodwill initially, and that term goodwill I think is key because that's the clarifying factor in the whole reason why open source works and why it has its advantages and why folks want to leverage the term open source is that goodwill was present. And then in a non-open source masquerading as open source license, like BSL, for example, is not goodwill focused. It's selfish, right? If you think of it in relatable terms, in relation terms, it's not goodwill. It's selfish. It's narcissistic in a way, even. Like as long as it doesn't hurt me, and I get it. In these cases, they're businesses. They want to continue to operate and thrive. And they want to use a license that allows their code to be open, allows contributions. But back to what you said, Stephen, is like, just don't call it open source because that's not what it is. It doesn't have that goodwill nature that open source, that truly is open source, thrives upon. And so it doesn't have that. It can't be open source.
Well, and I think it's actually that sort of goodwill, and I would add into that the trust, right? I think is sort of multi-level, right? Yeah. Because in other words, we tend to think about it sort of on a per project or per company basis, right? So that's typically how we sort of look at this, think of this, et cetera. And it's like, oh, hey, what does it mean in the context of this project, right? So when we talk to vendors, and I'm pretty sure every vendor that has relicensed has talked to us first, at least to sort of brief us and say, hey, here's what we're doing. And one of the things that we hear, in those conversations is, hey, this is not a big deal. Our community will be fine with it and so on, which, that's not typically how it plays out, but, some communities care more than others. But again, as we talked about earlier, it's selfish in the sense that they're looking at it purely from the perspective of their company, which, look, you have shareholders to keep happy and everything else. I get it. This is kind of capitalism at work. But the reality is that in the aggregate, right, the behavior is extraordinarily problematic, right? Because basically if one company does this, it makes it easier for the next company, easier for the next company, easier for the next company. And ultimately we end up in a world where, the stack that you're going to be working with is like, okay, I can't use that piece because we might compete with them. I can't use that piece because we have too many users, or I can't use that piece because we're at this revenue level, or I can't use it because I don't know how many people we have, or I don't know sort of any of these. And for me at least, RedMonk is a firm that we consider our first and foremost responsibility to be looking out for developers, frankly, even on things that they might not care about themselves, to try to say, hey, look, you're in the trenches, if you're building things day to day, you are concerned with what you're building day to day, right? You are not saying, hey, what happens if this, like, that's not what you get paid for, right? And so that's kind of our responsibility, is to take a look at, all right, hey, what's happening here sort of at scale, right? And the way that we put it to developers all the time, it's like, hey, if you're, sort of, in traffic, right? Our job is to kind of orbit the earth like as a satellite and say, okay, we have traffic over here, we have traffic over there, because we're trying to watch these larger patterns. And so, yeah, I think it's certainly a self-motivated behavior, which is, again, sort of understandable from a capitalist standpoint. But, like a lot of things within capitalism, I say this as a capitalist, it definitely introduces some problems sort of when you scale up, right? It just, in the aggregate, it's not a great thing.
The don't care aspect that Matt AC brought up, I've been thinking about this as we have been having this conversation, so bear with me if this analogy is not perfectly on, but this is somewhat how I feel about it. And my story is almost like coffee. I've been a coffee drinker my whole life, and the majority of my life, I always wanted to have good coffee, but only until later in my life did I understand what good coffee really was and began to truly care about how to make good coffee. And so for a while there, I was drinking, and no offense to the Keurig drinkers out there, or even espresso, if you're drinking that, it's not truly good coffee. It is coffee, but it's not good coffee. And as a coffee drinker, sometimes you just want to have coffee, right? As a software maker, sometimes you just want to have software, and you can just use it because it's open-ish, or it's source available, or it's truly open source, and you just don't care because you can use it. But only when the rubber meets the road, when you have to have good software or good coffee. And I'm not sure if good software translates very well in comparison, but the point I'm trying to make is that I didn't truly care about good coffee until I truly understood what good coffee was. And then I began to care about just-in-time grinding, and I cared about water temperature and, the pH balance of the water, and like just different aspects. Then I began to care. Basically, when the rubber met the road of good coffee, then I cared. So I can kind of understand your sentiment where you have developers who just do their job. And I get it. You want, like Jared in the past, or Jared currently with more care, you want to have access to good software out there that you can use in ways that benefit you and those that you're trying to serve in your job.
Yep.
And maybe you really don't necessarily, in quotes, care that it's open source by definition. But when it really matters, protecting that customer in Jared's case, or the company that you work for, protecting that company, when it truly matters, you do care and you will care. Just in that moment, it's sort of delayed care, or I think you said before, like, I forget what the word was, but, benign concern for essentially this care. Like, you do care, but just not deeply in that moment. And my analogy really is just good coffee.
You just want to talk about good coffee, didn't you?
Yeah, sure. Why not, right?
I'm down with that.
I think, honestly, you just have to remember, I think, sort of both ends of this, right? You have to remember what it was like to be somebody in the trenches as a developer.
Yeah.
And then you have to sort of understand, okay, and the example that I've used for people is, very early in my career, I was building a medical records, sort of system, right? So that doctors could sit at home, pull up medical records, right? And a bunch of these MRIs and CAT scans and everything else were in some really weird, obscure, I think it was TIFF. Anyway, some weird graphics format, right? Browsers could not display it natively. So we needed a plugin, and hunted across the internet. I was like, there has to be one, and found one. Was like, cool. Like, hey, this does exactly what we want. Like, here are the images, and and then it goes up to senior management. Like, yeah, what's the licensing for it? And I was like, no, you don't understand. Like, I got these images displayed. You know how hard this was, right? Like, and they're like, yeah, except we're rolling this out for a customer, and so we have to know what the license is. So that was certainly an instance for me in my career where it's like, look, I'm focused on the problem here, right? This is a super hard problem to solve. I couldn't do this. This thing does what I needed to do. But at the end of the day, from a business standpoint, there has to be somebody in place to say, yeah, no, we actually have to care about that. And we ended up having to get a different one because I can't remember what the licensing complication was, but basically it was a non-starter. Like, the client was going to be, like, day one they roll it out, they're screwed legally. And, so that's like I said, I have empathy, for developers that don't care, because I've been you, like, I've been in your shoes. But I can tell you, with the benefit of a little bit of experience, between now and then, and like I said, hundreds if not thousands of conversation with lawyers, much as we might hate it, this stuff matters. And, that's the problem.
What's up, friends? I'm here with Vijay Raji, CEO and founder of StatSig, where they help thousands of companies from startups to Fortune 500s to ship faster and smarter with a unified platform for feature flags, experimentation, and analytics. So, Vijay, what's the inception story of StatSig? Why did you build this?
Yeah, so StatSig started about 2.5 years ago. And before that, I was at Facebook for 10 years, where I saw firsthand the set of tools that people or engineers inside Facebook had access to. And this breadth and depth of the tools that actually led to the formation of the canonical engineering culture that Facebook is famous for. And that also got me thinking about, how do you distill all of that and bring it out to everyone? If every company wants to build that kind of an engineering culture of building and shipping things really fast, using data to make data-informed decisions, and then also informed to what do you need to go invest in next. And all of that was fascinating, was really, really powerful. So much so that I decided to quit Facebook and start this company. Yeah, so in the last 2.5 years, we've been building those tools that are helping engineers today to build and ship new features and then roll them out. And as they're rolling it out, also understand the impact of those features. Does it have bugs? Does it impact your customers in the way that you expected it? Or are there some side effects, unintended side effects? And knowing those things help you make your product better.
It's somewhat common now to hear this train of thought where an engineer or developer was at one of the big companies, Facebook, Google, Airbnb, you name it, and they get used to certain tooling on the inside. They get used to certain workflows, certain developer culture, certain ways of doing things, tooling, of course, and then they leave and they miss everything they had while at that company. And they go and they start their own company like you did. What are your thoughts on that? What are your thoughts on that kind of tech being on the inside of those big companies and those of us out here not in those companies without that tooling?
In order to get the same level of sophistication of tools that companies like Facebook, Google, Airbnb, and Uber have, you need to invest quite a bit. You need to take some of your best engineers and then go have them go build tools like this. And not every company has the luxury to go do that, right? Because it's a pretty large investment. And so the fact that the sophistication of those tools inside these companies have advanced so much, and that's left behind most of the other companies, and the tooling that they get access to, that's exactly the opportunity that I was okay, well, we need to bring those sophistication outside so everybody can be benefiting from these.
Okay, the next step is to go to statsig.com/changelog. They're offering our fans free white glove onboarding, including migration support, in addition to 5 million free events per month. That's massive. Test drive StatSig today at statsig.com/changelog. That's statsig.com/changelog. The link is in the show notes.
So we all agree that if it doesn't fit the open source definition, it's not open source. Stephen, what do you say to folks who say, well, the definition of open source is old and too constrained, and times have changed. Back when it was written, there was no such thing as AWS. There's no such thing as Llama or AI models. And it needs to change with the times because we're trying to be open source, but we're getting our lunch eaten by large corporations taking our stuff and rehosting it or whatever they say. And we need to change. We need to expand what open source means so that we can have a broader tent and still have clarity, but just have more of us fitting inside of that definition.
Yeah. So there's a lot to unpack there. So, looking at it from a commercial angle, right? It's been interesting that, a number of times people have argued about, oh, hey, it's this cloud stuff is sort of a brand new frontier and, people can pick this up and run with it. It's that's happened kind of forever, right? Commercial entities, how the, was it the networking stack? I think in Windows, sort of famously was BSD license, right? And so companies have been picking up this stuff forever and sort of selling it. In other words, you look at the IBM, for example, picked up and replaced and basically deprecated their own web server because they're like, no, the Apache one's just as good, if not better. Right? So these models have been around for a long time, right? There's nothing new about that. And from a cloud standpoint, really the argument that I always make is that there are, sort of two different ways to look at it. One, which is in the early days in particular, I can't tell you how many conversations I had with particularly people in the database space. And I was like, look at the growth here, from a managed database standpoint. You have to spin up your own managed database, right? Otherwise, other companies are going to do it for you, right? And it took some of them a lot longer than it should have. And sure enough, they've done that. And guess what? The businesses took off, right? So in Mongo's case, I'll get the numbers probably a little wrong, but it was like about 10 years for them to hit a 100 million run rate, for their on-prem business. They did it in like 2.5, sort of from a services standpoint, right? So, sort of option number one is spin up your own services business. And oh, by the way, you can differentiate your own software in the services business by releasing adjacent features that maybe don't make it back to open source. You can differentiate pretty easily, sort of when you do that, right? So there are easily ways to compete, sort of on the cloud front. And then, sort of the sort of other piece of this is that, I had a conversation with, somebody a while ago, which is, hey, nobody wants to see their work picked up and sort of just used and sort of repurposed. And you're like, that's what the licenses permit, right? I mean, that's just
right.
How this works. Like, if you don't want that, then great, don't release it under that license. It's pretty straightforward. And the thing that a lot of the companies really don't want to hear as well is that they want to exclusively monetize an asset, which I get. Like, you wrote it, you
Right.
want to sort of capture the maximum profits. But the interesting thing that we hear all the time is, these companies can't make money because they're competing with cloud. And it's like, yeah, they've gone public. Like, they're multi-billion-dollar companies in many cases, while competing, with, when they change licenses, they're already multi-billion-dollar companies. And it's like, okay, really, what are we talking? No, they can make money. And in many cases, the sort of, de facto anointment of these companies as market leaders, right? So in other words, if you're AWS and you pick, one of these companies and you spin up your own instance, what you're telling the market is that, yeah, we've looked at all these, databases, search, whatever it might be. We've looked at all of them and we think this is the best and most popular one, right? So on the one hand, that sucks if you're the company that's being competed with. On the other hand, it is a lot worse to be one of the competitors, right? Because you're like, oh, wait, so I'm not as popular. Like, AWS is, I'm not the kind of opportunity that AWS is even interested in. So that's the thing. There are ancillary benefits, to the cloud companies, competing with these companies. And it's like, anyway, you try to have these conversations with a lot of the vendors and they don't really go that well, perhaps not surprisingly. And if you talk to the investors, it goes even less well. Those are typically not terribly productive conversations.
What's stopping a company like that in this scenario where their database is chosen to be an AWS service that spins up and it's like, wow, we're blessed by AWS, but now we have to compete. What's stopping them from literally going to AWS and saying, hey, I know you can use this open source software we produce. Thank you so much for believing in our hard work and deciding to make it an AWS service. But what if you helped us? What if we made a business deal where you could totally go and just use that with no payment to us, no funding to us whatsoever, and you can just do it free and clear because that's how open source works. But what if you also respected that ability, but also said, what if we help fund, XYZ company that produces this phenomenal database that you clearly want to leverage for your customers' benefit? What if you helped us through a business deal? Our software is still open source. You can totally go and never make this deal with us. But what if you did so that we can continue to make this software amazing and keep the open source spirit alive? Like, is that just a non-conversation happening out there? Or is that happening and they're like, nah, we're not going to do that?
Honestly, it's mostly, I think it's mostly politics. And it's mostly the fact that, these companies, and more particularly their boards, sort of are aiming for exclusivity, right? They don't want to share the pool. You could sort of make the argument on paper, like, hey, look, if you worked, to your point, if you worked in concert, you can have 100% of, I don't know, make up numbers, like a $50 million market, or you can have 80% of a $300 billion market, right? Like, that's not the conversation that most of them are having, right? I think that could change, sort of in the sense that, I think you could see, some movement on the part of the cloud providers, which are looking at this and saying, all right, do we really want to maintain forks indefinitely? Do we really want to sort of be at war? So, I mean, over the longer term, there's some potential, for some change dynamics there. But, for better or for worse, the reality in most cases is, the dynamics of any partnership, right? Set open source and clouds and so on aside, the dynamics of any partnership are complicated, right? And they're hard to maintain. Yeah. There's a lot of moving pieces. And a lot of times, it's something as simple as, hey, you get to the, 5-yard line, right? With a deal, and then somebody takes a new job, right? And that partnership is now sort of back to square one, right?
Yeah.
And
been there.
So, I mean, there's nothing on paper that says that can't work as an approach, but, just the sort of political reality within most organizations at this point is that I think it'll be a little while before we see that playing out.
One interesting side effect in AWS's case in particular is that they've kind of become this open source villain to a certain extent. Like their reputation in the community is pretty tarnished because of what is completely legal according to the license, and a lot of us just think isn't in the spirit of open source. Because Adam, your idea is more in the spirit of open source, of like contribute back to this thing, which you're just saying resources is money, right? Go ahead and provide your hosted offering and stuff, but like contribute back in some sort of way, and we're all good here. But so much kind of, it's not wolf crying, but so much like you said, Steve, is that these large corporations set themselves up as David versus Goliath in the way they speak about it. And it's not really the case. It's like, a mini Goliath versus a bigger Goliath is kind of what's going on. But we still root for the underdog, and we still see what looks like injustice. And so AWS does have, at least in my opinion, and in the way I hear people talk about it, not the best reputation in open source because of what they're doing. And I wonder if that would be, to the right VP or to the right C-level executive, something that would make them maybe change their approach to a certain extent. I don't know.
Yeah, I think to me, AWS is an interesting case, right? Because they're not where they need to be, right? And I think they would sort of, at least privately, sort of say, hey, there's always work to be done and so on. I will say that the put it this way, the conversations we have with them around open source today versus 10 years ago are 180 degrees, right? And, I think, the reality for, AWS for sure, but frankly, Microsoft and Google to a lesser extent, they're always going to be the bad guy because they're the big guy, right? So, look, it's
sort of, but I think on the other side, Microsoft has repaired its reputation to a certain extent with open.
Microsoft has done quite a bit, for sure. But in other words, when we're thinking about the the realities of sort of running sort of some of these open source projects at scale, put it this way, Amazon did it itself no favors, nor did Elastic for that matter, sort of in the way that whole thing went down, right? And that was, and I wrote this at the time, right? It's sort of bad for everybody involved, it does damage and so on, but the difficulty is that, like everything else from a reputational standpoint, have we seen changes within AWS? For sure. In other words, just purely in terms of staffing, right? The number of people who are in and involved and contributing back to open source is, again, night and day different than it was a while ago. The difficulty is that, once your reputation takes a hit, right, this is true, obviously, for people as well as businesses.
Yeah.
The recovery of that's going to be a process. As to your point, Jared, in terms of Microsoft, that was a decade plus rehab, right? Because Microsoft, sort of old Microsoft in the Ballmer era, I can't remember, I can't tell you how many times we talked to, folks over there like, hey, we're doing all these things for open source. And I'm like, yeah, but every time Ballmer opens his mouth, he sets you back like 10 steps.
Yeah.
And,
Right.
You have a new leader, in Nadella, and they've done the right, not in every case, of course, but they have done better than they have for an extended period of time, and their reputation's recovered, and jury's out. Will we see that from AWS? Who knows?
Yeah.
But could it be better, sort of 2 or 3 years from now than it is today? I think potentially, yeah.
And they're still fighting that fight. They haven't fully recovered. They've recovered quite a bit, Microsoft-wise, to the dev community. But I would say the one thing they do show, which you just said that they don't always get it right, is they've shown goodwill in the relationship of Microsoft to the community of developers. They've shown that they have intentions to respect and to play fair in ways. There's ways that they don't play fair, but they've shown, I think in this change, what has come out is the idea that they intend to be good for everybody.
I think what ultimately matters is that Honestly, I guess I'd less use the word goodwill than just being smart about how and where you interact and being sort of upfront, right? So in other words, a decade or more ago, right, companies were coming to us and saying, I don't understand how IBM has this good reputation with open source. And it's like, hey, they're doing these things that we don't agree with. And it's like, right, but they're transparent in terms of what they're doing. They're setting expectations up front. They're doing things like, hey, we're going to invest $1 billion in Linux. And, so it wasn't there was no kumbaya, like, you see companies try this from time to time. It's like, oh, we love open source. And it's like, trying to evoke sentiment and emotion and so on as a company. It's very difficult to do. The thing that you want to see more from companies these days is, okay, just understand where open source fits, with your business model, do the right thing as much as you can, and, try to respect the communities and the projects involved, right? And that doesn't mean that you're going to, do what the community wants every time. It doesn't mean that you're going to do what the community wants most of the time. But if you are basically consistent in your approach and like, here's how we're going to do things, and you set those expectations, more often than not, you can keep yourself not out of trouble, but at least out of major trouble.
When we think about licensing with the data model world, in the world of AI, it seems like it's getting more complicated and different. And I wonder if the open source definition even applies there. I mean, we don't use it to talk about a novel or an article like we use different kind of licensing for that kind of stuff. I do follow opensource.org's RSS. I do see them talking, like they're having meetings about artificial intelligence. I don't really read the details there, but like, are they working on new licenses for this kind of stuff? Because it is kind of a different thing. There's code involved, but there's also data just there. And I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, honestly, to me, that's kind of the wild, wild west. And you've actually had Louis V on before. Like those are the people that the people who are lawyers are trained. I look to folks like that to try to sort of understand. Van Lindenberg is another guy, they pay a ton of attention to sort of in that space. The AI side of things is, honestly, fractally more complex because it's not just the training data. Then you get into the weight. It's like, okay, it's basically a string of numbers. Like, how do we license that? Like, is that even licensable? And, that's one of the sort of fun things from an AI standpoint. We get asked all the time, like, licensing implications, right? And it's like a new question or new brain teaser every day, right? So it was trying to remember the Supreme Court case, which came out, I should know it. But anyhow, it came out recently and it's like, now there's some question as to whether output from AI systems is copyrightable. It's like, I hadn't thought, everything, all my focus had been on the inputs, right? So in other words, is it legal, for example, to consume training data? Is it legal for companies to use these product, these trained products and so on? Have the additional question of like, okay, I use one of these products and I output something, can I copyright that? Like, or is that a transformative? So all of which is to say is that AI is going to challenge the sort of assumptions and the basis for a lot of these licenses. And I don't have any idea how that's going to play out. And frankly, the market doesn't. Like, one of our standard responses is like, hey, what's the, legalities of the system? I'm like, I don't know. Look at this case, look at that case. Like they're pending. We'll know more, when that's resolved. So yeah, the data side of things it's a brand new frontier, put it that way.
Yeah. I wonder if the merging of that world with our world as software systems, get significantly more complex, and they're probably weaving in and out of them different inferences from models here and there, if like that will further muddy the water of what open source is.
Well, I think it might further muddy the water of what open source is, but in other words, at a minimum, we're going to have to come up with sort of new ways to do this. So this is a number of years ago, there was a business I was talking to that, I probably shouldn't say which. Anyway, they had, these sort of, dramatically oversized, sort of memory allocation for a distributed system. And I was like, what the hell's going on? Like, you don't need this much memory. And it turned out that they had two different data sets that they were not allowed to combine, except that their lawyers had determined that when they're in memory together, they're not technically combined because they're not on a disk. And I was just like, what? Like, so I guess my point is that I think what we're going to see from an AI standpoint, this is all pre, sort of AI, at least the sort of more recent AI boom. I think what we're going to end up seeing is that, we're going to see, we're going to have to see the evolution of more approaches. And I think what we'll end up seeing is, I think one possibility is that I think we'll end up seeing sort of the creation of a new class of licenses or licensing that applies to these these sort of AI weights, models, data, training data, et cetera. Because it's going to have to be its own brand, its own thing.
I'm with you, Jared. I was considering the same question. Like, because the AI world is almost mainstream, whereas developers still sort of niche, The AI brings in a lot of people to the room, not just developers. And if the contents of the room gets bigger and developers become a minority, or those who care about open source and its definition, and the whole reason why we're having this conversation, because the three of us do care, because more people come in to the space that blur the lines of what open source means and say, well, we really need a new definition here, or whatever it might be. Like, we need a different license. I just wonder if that influx of folks won't outweigh us screaming, hey, it matters. Because they just take over in numbers. We become a minority and they're a majority, because it's just so much that AI has just become so mainstream this year, almost in an instant.
Yeah, I mean, my hope is ultimately that, we leave those sorts of decisions to policymakers, right? And I say that reluctantly, but in other words...
Yeah, I'm not sure. Have you seen the questions they ask at these hearings?
I mean, you need people who are trained, right? To have, it's honestly why, with AI, I have, obviously, as we've hopefully demonstrated over the course of this episode, I have very strong opinions on licensing and how it should and shouldn't be done, and definitions and all that. When it comes to AI, I'm still learning. Right. I've spent past couple decades understanding, all right, how does it apply to source code? What are the mechanisms? What are the levers and all that? With AI, it is, so in other words, what I try to do as somebody who, is responsible for researching and writing about the field is, take a step back. Okay, what are people who are trained in this? What do they see? What are they thinking? What are their opinions? And, when it comes to your everyday average user of, frankly, any of these generative systems, as an example, right, whether it's, ChatGPT or Midjourney or what have you, my hope is that they don't try to be lawyers, leave the licensing to the lawyers.
Yeah.
But I don't know, maybe that'll play out about as well in AI as it does in source code. So we'll see.
The output argument, though, is an interesting one. Considering the copyrightable nature of the output, I think is quite compelling, because we have all been focused on the inputs and, what makes up the possibility of even the generative, and then not so much what is generated. Because as a user of it, I don't want to be restricted on what I can do with it, because that's the whole point of using it in the first place, right?
Yep.
But at the same time, I understand the inputs, to some degree or many degrees, obviously have an implication to what is output. But I think, it is absolutely a Wild West. I'm just thinking recent usages, and if I had to somehow adhere to a usage license of what I've recently generated through artificial intelligence, but it's also part of my ideas too, because I'm probing it, and because of its input, what it has available to it, it's a dance in a way. It definitely is a new creation, but as a user of it on the daily, I would be pissed and upset and sad if I had to somehow adhere to restrictions or licenses of how I use what I generated with it.
So a typical developer today says, 30, even just John Evans recently on our show said 30% of my code is now written by Copilot. And so does that mean he only has a 70% copyright on his finished product? What does that mean?
Yeah. Well, I mean, and what does it mean for an individual, but what does it mean for business?
Well, yeah, of course.
Right?
Yeah, totally.
If you're using for example, if you're using it to write high-speed trading algorithms, right? Do you not own the copyright to that? If somebody takes that and walks out the door, is that fine? Because it's not copyrightable. I don't know. So yeah, the AI licensing is just like I said, it's fractally complex. You're I don't understand how this is going to play out. But, fortunately, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not the one who has to figure it out.
At the practical level, where we actually, put our license in our projects, for instance, it might play out similar to how we do with creative assets now, where you're code is licensed under this license. Assets are licensed under this Creative Commons license. Maybe it's data models are licensed under this other thing. And so you just have multiple licenses for subsections of your system. I'm just thinking about how an open source maintainer might put together their project in the future world where all these things are involved in a piece of software. Maybe that's just a matter. I know there's OpenRail and there's a bunch of other things going on with, and I just subscribe to Louis Villa's newsletter, and I hope he can keep me up to date like you, Steve.
That is excellent. And anybody listening, if you want to, if the AI licensing thing is of interest to you, you have to subscribe to it. What is it? The Open-ish
Open-ish newsletter.
Yeah, .ml, what do we think? Anyway.
Yeah, something like that. We'll link to it in the show notes. My only complaint with it, Lewis, is that it does not publish enough. Come on, man. We need more. We need he has these
poor guy's got a day job.
I know. He has these very long, like monthly or even less than every month. And I'm like, that's a lot to read, but I could read smaller chunks in smaller cadences. So
that's fair.
That's me vouching for how good it is in a weird way.
We should get him back on. It's been a while.
Yeah. It has.
Yeah, definitely get him on to talk more AI. That was a great episode. I love that one.
Thank you.
I was trying to search the GitHub blog for this, but I thought I saw recently something about them defending Copilot copyright or something like that. But does that ring a bell to either of you?
Yeah. So Microsoft, I wasn't briefed, but I saw presumably the same articles. Apparently, they are in a position where they're basically going to indemnify users, which is a big deal, right? At least from my perspective, right? Because It's one thing to say, hey, our lawyers have determined it's fine for you to use this. It's a different thing to basically step up and say, yeah, no, if somebody takes you to court, we'll indemnify you, right? That's a step change, right? In terms of your level of responsibility for the output. And, if nothing else, it's a signal from the company that they feel pretty good about, sort of their legal footing, because what they don't want to do is run around and indemnify a ton of customers. It's not,
right.
Not good business for them. So, I won't sort of gauge, sort of the outcomes from a legal standpoint, but I think, that's certainly a pretty strong market signal that they feel good about their chances.
That reminds me, Jared, of your recent episode on JS Party, Elon Musk and the licensing and, would you get sued for your tweets? I forget I'm paraphrasing the conversation, but that was hilarious. Headlines.
Yeah, he guaranteed that he would, what did he say? He said so many things, you can't keep up with them all. He said something along the lines of that they would pay legal fees for people whose bosses are mad at them for their tweets or something. Like something I think it was just a flippant thing that he said, but it was like another course made news.
Yeah. I think like a lot of things that come out of his mouth, the lawyers somewhere were probably like, oh my God, no.
Yes, no. Please don't hold us to this.
Yeah. Microsoft's a different deal.
Microsoft, I think, they probably had a more calculated statement.
So this indemnification, was that from Microsoft or was that from GitHub? Because I couldn't find it on the GitHub blog, so I think it was from Microsoft.
I'd have to go back and look. I believe it's from Microsoft. That's my recollection.
So that means that that's even blurring the lines between Microsoft and GitHub too, because Copilot is a GitHub product. It's owned by Microsoft, but it's a GitHub product. Yeah,
but Copilot is also surfaced up in Microsoft projects as well. That's going to be their brand, right? Yeah. So Copilot is frankly, it's going to be. It's like it is for some, you see Google does this with like Duet, right? Duet is their brand for, their generative LLM, or their conversational interface, right? It's in all kinds of like Workspace and GCP and, sort of all these other pieces. So, yeah, because in other words, Microsoft, if they want to leverage the technology, they have to make a decision, is this legal or is it not, right? And clearly they've come to they have come to the conclusion that it was, because otherwise you don't release that project and invest in it, what they have. But like I said, there's a difference between, hey, we're going to do this and hope it's legal versus, hey, we're going to indemnify people. And you've seen this sort of historically in open source. I'm trying to think of an example, where, customers have said, okay, this is like going way back, with the SCO license issue with respect to Linux kernel. One of the questions was like, hey, will you indemnify us? Right. And it was really difficult for, even for companies that were like, no, hey, legally, I'm certain we're on solid footing. If you're a smaller company at that time, which most of the open source companies were, indemnification's like, how would you do that? Practically speaking, you just don't have the resources. Mm-hmm. So the point is that from a Microsoft standpoint, when I saw that was a pretty big deal.
This is a changelog news break. PageFind looks pretty cool. It's a fully static search library that aims to perform well on large sites while using as little of your user's bandwidth as possible and without hosting any infrastructure. It runs after your static site generator, like Hugo, 11D, Astro, etc., and generates a static search bundle to add to your built files. It then exposes a JavaScript search API that can be used anywhere on your site. Quote, the goal of PageFind is that websites with tens of thousands of pages should be searchable by someone in their browser while consuming as little bandwidth as possible. PageFind's search index is split into chunks so that searching in the browser only ever needs to load a small subset of the search index. PageFind can run a full-text search on a 10,000-page site with a total network payload under 300 kilobytes, including the PageFind library itself. For most sites, this will be closer to 100 kilobytes. End quote. I'd love to see a comparison, link me up if you know of one, but my guess is that this could easily replace Algolia on lots of open source docs and websites. One less service to depend on. Why not, right? You just heard one of our 5 top stories from Monday's Changelog News. Subscribe to the podcast to get all of the week's top stories and pop your email address in at changelog.com/news to also receive our free companion email with even more developer news worth your attention. Once again, that's changelog.com/news. So, Steve, do you like to predict the future at all? Is this something you do as an industry analyst?
Yeah. So if Brian Cantrell happens to listen to this, he'll get a chuckle out of this. But so for many years, I did these predictions at the end of the year, and I did pretty well. Like, it's like 60-70%. And, it was noted by, Brian noted that my predictions were a little safe. So then I was like, okay, I'll take some shots, and I predicted some things, and my accuracy was not so good.
Yeah.
So then the good news is that I had a kid was just like, she's going to turn 8 in November. And it was like, oh, I don't have the time. I'm so tired. I'm trying to do too many things. So it's been a couple of years since I did predictions, but
okay. Well, I'll allow a safe one here. What I was thinking is one of the things that you say in the post is that open source is at a crossroads. And I thought that was true. And I thought, hey, maybe even make a good title for this episode. We'll see when the minds combine between Adam and I, what we come up with. But if it's at a crossroads, you're going to go one way or you're going to go the other from a crossroads. So I'm curious what you think the trend is. Like, where is open source headed? Are we going to have more munging of the term? Are we going to have more things that are open-ish claiming to be open source? Are we going to have it like resolutely defended and these things will be clearly delineated that they're not open source? What do you think it's headed if you had to project a little bit?
Yeah, so let me tease that apart just a bit in the sense that the direction of travel, I think, from the standpoint of commercial open source licensing is pretty inarguable at this point. We're going to see more of this, right? Either, sort of the quote unquote bait and switch model, right? More companies are going to sort of, relicense their assets. I don't think we'll see companies start, with BSL and so on as much for the reasons that we talked about earlier. I think Adam mentioned this where it's like, yeah, I wouldn't have started if it was licensed that way, right? So, but in other words, if I have to, if we're having this conversation 3, 4, 5 years from now, like, are there going to be more of these companies who have relicensed? The answer to me is, I don't see how you build the argument otherwise, which, like I said, I don't think that's a great thing for the industry, but again, companies have the right to do what they will. The bigger question to me is, does the open source term itself get, munged, to use your term, Jared? Like, I think my hope is no. And at least I will say this, like, having put out the piece, having had a lot of conversations since, I've talked to people who didn't care before, and they don't care necessarily now, but they at least understand, hey, this is okay. I can understand that there may be some issues with that. Right. And so, yeah, I mean, I've been in this industry too long to be hopeful about the sort of ethics involved in terms of people getting together and doing the right thing from a licensing standpoint. But yeah, I like I said, I think we'll see more relicensed assets, and if I had to bet, I would probably bet that the term itself is pretty damaged a couple years from now.
We spent this whole conversation not mentioning the OSI though. Like, I think if anybody's gonna defend it, they would step up and defend, right? Like they maintain, the list. Yeah.
I mean, the OSI maintains the definition. I mean, put it this way, I think the OSI's biggest issue for many years has just been staffing and funding, right? That is, haven't had the resources to do the kinds of campaigns, that you need to do, right? Like, so, you have individual voices out there, who are basically saying, hey, this is a problem, here's why, writing pieces like the one that, sort of, kicked off this particular conversation. But that's not enough, right? We need a more systemic campaign. The OSI has been more aggressive on this front recently. I was on a webinar with Stefano from the OSI, I don't know, last month, 2 months ago, after the sort of Llama news broke. I think he's done a good job trying to up level, sort of this from a visibility standpoint. But like I said, they're just not resourced, right? In other words, when you have a company with the resources of a Meta running around telling fleets of journalists, hey, I took this thing that's not open source and calling it open source, and the journalists, I don't blame them, right? In other words, the tech press is hard pressed these days, right? 20 years ago, you had people who'd been on the beat for a while, and they knew, the industry in many cases as well as the analysts did. Now they're covering way too much, right? And they can't, keep track of these nuances. And so when you have Meta, companies that size running around misusing the term, it's very, very difficult for an organization the size and scope of the OSI to combat that. So my hope is that, they'll get more support, from folks that are in the industry and, believe that term matters. But, we'll see how that plays out.
Well, you left us on a dour note, Steve. I don't know how do we recover from here?
That's the problem. Every one of these conversations I tend to have, people are like, "Oh, you don't seem that optimistic," and I'm like, "I'm not." And like I said, I have said this many times. There's this sort of meme or stereotype as analysts who are like, "Oh no, I know everything and I know exactly how things are going to play out." It's like, no, not us, not me. So I've been wrong before. I will be wrong again, and hopefully this is one of those times. But, as somebody who has been publicly saying the things that I have and, privately, and I can't tell you how many conversations I have had, individuals, companies, projects, foundations, agitating on just these issues, the direction of travel it's tough to see, because it's, like I said, on the one hand, you talk to the company, you talk to an individual, it's like, hey, I get your choice. Totally understand it. But in the aggregate, like I said, this is one of the reasons I use the climate change analogy, where it's like, hey, people got to do what they got to do. And yet, what is it like, at least up here in Maine, like 9 of the 10 hottest seasons have been like in the last decade. That's probably not great. So
I'm in Texas, and it's pretty hot this year. Hotter than Texas should be, that's for sure. For sustained times, like 90 days plus at 100 degrees plus. And obviously in the evening it goes down, but peak temperature of the day recorded above 100 degrees for 90 plus days. I mean, my grass is not grass anymore. You know what I mean? Like it's crunchy stuff, as they say.
Yep. And meanwhile, we have a hurricane poised to hit us this weekend. So
that's very. I've been watching that too, and geez.
Yeah, good times.
Let's focus on things we can control, because we can't control the weather necessarily. We can control to some degree how we influence the weather in aggregate or maybe individually. If the OSI is important in this ongoing definition of open source and even the defending of it, what do you know about them that we can do to... We've never had anybody from the OSI on this podcast here. Like, we've talked to Josh Simmons when he was, I think, still part of the OSI, but not in light of the goings on at OSI by any means. So we've never had like a conversation.
Yeah. I'd reach out to Stefano, for sure. And, see if he'll come on. I'm sure he would. And, at the end of the day, I mean, I think, the difference between, one of the differences, I should say, between climate change and open source is that there are things that every developer can do, right? So in other words, just understand and realize that you might not think this matters, but it does. It doesn't mean you have to do anything. Right. But also part of it is that, hey, maybe you push back when somebody says, hey, I have this open source license, and you're like, well, what is it? It's like some weird non-commercial derivative. You can say, oh, cool. Hey, I appreciate the source code, but that's actually not open source. Right. And so, that's the thing. Like, what can, sort of an individual do about climate change? Probably not a lot. You can make better choices, from a household basis and all that. But there are things that every developer can do. And if developers as a group, sort of demonstrate that, again, not that everybody has to license everything in one way, but if they demonstrate that, hey, we care, like this, these definitions matter to us, even companies that are misusing the term will have to, sort of stand up and pay attention. So hopefully that happens. And, like I said, Stefano can, coming on, I think would certainly help that, to that end.
Well, they're a 501c3. I don't know if they do much, funding rounds or like donation rallies or whatever you might call this call to action. I feel like, if they're understaffed or undersupported, maybe that's one way too, to not so much be a meta-sized donation, but definitely, which is sort of a nice pun in a way, that they can get support from everyday folks to provide their time, their attention, and obviously their vote, that it does matter.
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing. Yeah. I mean, every developer, just sort of giving them, attention and basically acknowledging like, hey, this matters and it's something we should care about, is a good thing.
If someone's listening to this podcast, maybe they're a CEO or a founder of said company that may be considering a bait and switch in the future. They've got a permissively licensed open source, commercially open source software, costs, that kind of company, whatever. And they're considering, man, we've really got to get some control here. What do you personally say to someone in those shoes to consider with this choice? Do they go to Red Monk and say, can we have you analyze our source code in our community? What do you personally say to them, in regard to this consideration of, they may not mean to do a bait and switch, but if they do the thing, it would be? What do you say to them?
Well, that's where it's kind of tricky in the sense that because our responsibility is to our client, right? We have to tell them sort of what's best for them. I tend to, in most cases, not believe that a bait and switch is the right way to do things. And certainly I don't believe it from an industry standpoint, as we've talked about. From a company standpoint, basically my sort of argument, we talked about this a little bit, sort of earlier in the show, was basically look at your model, right? In many cases, people are trying to solve business model issues with a license. And that's not typically the way that, at least in my view, right, things should be solved. So in other words, if you're competing, for example, with, or if you're poised to compete with, larger clouds, what can you do to differentiate? Well, there's lots of things, right? You're offering a service, you need to offer service first, but then also you can offer adjacencies, you can offer, features that are not present in the open source code. And, on the one hand, that's a bummer because it means less open source. But on the flip side, if you are still providing the code itself, the core code itself, unencumbered, with these sort of complicated licenses, that's, probably a better outcome in a sort of longer term. So yeah, there's no one way to think about it. A lot of it depends on, who wrote the IP, right? What is the precise license that you're under? What is the nature of your community, right? What's the nature of your adoption? What's the nature of your market, and so on? So a lot of times when we sit down with companies, it's just going through these and trying to understand, all right, what's your exact position and, what makes the best sense for you? And, to the extent that we can steer people away from it, great, we try. And yeah, I think I can say that, the majority of companies that have relicensed are customers of ours. We try to talk them out of it. And in I think the overwhelming majority of cases. And then, once they've said, okay, this is what we're going to do, then, my job at that point is to try to provide the best advice in terms of minimizing and mitigating the impact on the community, right? Okay, if you're going to do this, here's what to do. So for example, right, when Hashi comes out and relicenses, but is very clear to, be upfront and set expectations, this is not open source, that is the type of advice that we'd give, right? Which is, hey, if you're going to do this, there's a way to do it that is, less damaging than the way that some other folks do. It's a hard, complicated question.
How do you all maintain, I think you have great credibility. How does Red Monk and you personally maintain such great credibility when, at the bottom of your post, you say disclosure, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, and Red Hat are Red Monk customers. Meta is not. You say that, like, how do you put such a good point out that is against clients even? It's not always for them. How do you maintain that line when you have customers and clients and then your obvious opinion as a company and individually?
Yeah. So, we decided pretty early on, within the first month that, you can't go down the, sort of pay for play, your opinions for sale model, right? Because once you do that, you just don't have, we were talking about reputations earlier. Once you do that, you just don't get it back, right? And so we have always tried to be, if anything, overly, sort of honest and transparent. We're diplomatic about it. We're not going out and posting hot takes on sort of companies and so on. But in other words, if we think that a company's doing something wrong, we say that we're doing it wrong. We got interviewed years ago, and it was like, do you think you should be under less scrutiny, from a transparency and an honesty and ethical standpoint than, larger analyst firms? We're like, no, like we're much smaller. We should be under, if anything, more scrutiny. And they said, well, I don't understand. Like, how's that function? And it's like, it's pretty simple. We post a, sort of list at the bottom. These are the people who are paying us, and these are people who aren't. Developers, they may or may not care about licenses, but they're smart. And if we came out and we're basically consistently saying great things about our customers and bad things about our, the people who aren't paying us, then, our reputation is going to be gone pretty quickly. So, we're fortunate, clients are not always thrilled with the things we put out, but they also understand that that's part of, it's part of what makes us, hopefully, sort of a trusted, asset, in that, we're not coming out and just like, hey, this is the greatest thing in the world because, so-and-so paid us. Like, not a model that works. So, like I said, we have certainly gotten our share of emails like, what did you just write or whatever. And the interesting thing actually is that, very frequently we'll post something critical. We'll hear from a whole bunch of people within the company. They're like, yes, please keep doing that because I've been saying this. No one's listening. So yeah, it's, as I said, I'm sure we could make a lot more money if we just sold out and at least for a little while, until your reputation shot. But that's not the way we do things.
Well, we feel the pain of towing that line. We have similar. We're not analysts, but we do certainly examine and question and scrutinize players. And some of those players decide to work with us through sponsorships or promotions, and some don't. And we always say what we think and how we feel with tact, of course, and respect, regardless of the relationship. And we're always, clear about those things as well. But it's tough because, like you said, you could make more money if you did X, but then you would have zero satisfaction and no one would really trust you. And then our listeners wouldn't really care. One thing we have around here is listeners first. So every decision we make is listeners first. Like if our listeners don't want to hear it, wouldn't like it, whatever the scrutinizing point might be, then we're going to reconsider that obviously, or consider even more closely, because our ambitions and our desire is for our listeners to always trust and enjoy the content we put out. And then that translates also to the sponsors that we decide to work with. Because sometimes, in most cases, we get to say no just as much as we get to say yes. Like we choose them just as much as they choose us. It's challenging to toe that line.
It's challenging. I think the one thing else, the longer that you do this, at least in our case, we've had a couple clients, frankly, companies that have relicensed, right? That basically, we said, nah, we don't think you should do this, and blah blah blah. And they're like, okay, cool, we're out of here. And the interesting thing is that they come back later. Right. Not for that advice, obviously, they've already made that, but it's like, I think if you provide a sort of valuable service, not that you get it right every time or, not certainly that we're right every time as we talked about, but, I think people will sort of ultimately come to recognize what you stand for. And, they may get upset about things from time to time, but I think over the long haul, it's really the better bet is sort of in being honest with your audience, right? Because like I say, credibility is everything, to me in this business.
For sure. It's not challenging to maintain our morals by any means, but it is challenging in the fact that just doing business is challenging when you have challenge. I'm like a famous politician in that moment. Anyways, I digress.
Yeah.
What you got to say, Jared? Anything else? What's left?
Oh, no, I was just thinking that I literally could have, I said almost the exact same thing Steven said days ago to somebody about this exact same topic. It's just that I said, I think at the end, well, we have to sleep. We make a lot less money this way, but we do sleep well at night. So
I didn't know it.
That's the choice that we continue to make because we'd rather sleep well than
for sure
roll around in
sure
short-term riches. Well, Steven, I just want to say thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah,
it's kind of a shame. It's been so many years. We've never had you on so far. So we're happy to finally do that. I've been fans of your guys' work for a very long time, and
right back at you.
Voice of reason and sense, and I'm nodding along most of the time whenever I'm reading something that Red Monk is writing. So appreciate you guys and your voice in the community. I think you're showing us what we need to do. I think if we do believe that open source matters and we need to protect it individually, or if we can act collectively, of course, but loud voices of logic and reasoning, more of those, I think is can't hurt in this battle to keep the clarity that we currently have and enjoy. So that would be my parting words. Anything from you guys as we close out?
No, I'm just a pleasure to be on, and I had the pleasure of actually recommending you folks to one of our clients just the other day because it's a quality show. Happy to be on.
Thank you so much. I like what Jared said. We've been fans for years now, and now that we're friends to some degree, we'll have to have you back on more frequently and get more
anytime.
Mild takes, hot takes. I don't know.
Well-reasoned takes.
Well, hopefully the news is better next time than it is this time.
Yeah.
Let's say that.
Thanks, Steven.
My pleasure.
So the definition of open source, it means something, and it's worth protecting And I believe that if you're listening to this podcast, yes, you are in the small but vocal minority who cares. And if you don't care and you're listening to this, you should care, because open source has provided a way for many, many people to thrive. And open source matters. It matters to me. It matters to Jared. It matters to many people out there in the industry. And we need to ensure that it remains fought for, it remains protected. The small but vocal minority is the last stand. And that's you. Hey, guess what? There is a bonus. Yes, a bonus for our Plus subscribers on this podcast. So you're gonna like it. I liked it. I think you'll like it. If you're not a Plus subscriber, you can correct that right now. It's too easy. Changelog.com/plus. It's better. That was ad-lib just now, by the way. Changelog.com/plus. $10 a month, $100 a year. Closer to that cool changelog metal. No ads. Directly support us. And, if we meet you in person, we owe you a hug if you want one, or a very firm handshake. You pick. Again, changelog.com/plus. A massive thank you again to our friends at Fastly, our friends at Fly, and our awesome friends at TypeSense, and our Beats Master in Residence, Breakmaster Cylinder, bringing the beats as usual. One more thing, there is no Changelog and Friends this Friday. Jared and I are in St. Louis right now at Strange Loop. And if you're there, if you're listening to this for some reason and you're there or you're going to be there, come and say hi. We are in the sponsor area, just hanging out, podcasting. Make sure you come say hello. We want to meet you, and we'll see you there. Well, that's it. This show's done. We'll see you next week.